So we have begun a new series called Tipping Point, on the edge of breakdown or breakthrough. We want to talk about how do we stand as the people of God when we feel like we are on the edge of something significant in the Spirit, on the edge of breakthrough of a move of God, and yet at the same time, we're aware of our own vulnerability in that time, maybe hyper aware of our own fragility, and we feel like we're on the edge of a breakdown. I know I feel this in my own heart, times where I'm longing to see what God is going to do, where I feel like we are perhaps on the edge of a breakthrough as a church community, even myself personally, and at other times feel like, man, I have come to the end of myself. There's a voice that's in my head, if I'm honest, seeking to be just vulnerable in myself in this moment that says, what if? And it's what if on the breakthrough side, what if the Spirit of God came and moved in power? What if we began to see the Spirit break out and my heart is churning for more of the Holy Spirit and move in our communities, in our homes, and in our families, and in our city? And at the same time, there's another what if that whispers that says, what if you're wrong? What if you got the vision off? What if we don't actually have what it takes? What if we've bitten off more than we can chew? And so we are going to step into that in this series, because we believe time and again, God moves in those moments, what we are calling tipping point moments, when you feel like you are on the edge, when it feels like everything could fall into place or everything could just as easily fall apart. And time and again, God shows up in those moments, in those tipping point moments, and in faithfulness, as the followers of God choose to cling to Him in those moments, we see the power of breakthrough. But that power of breakthrough is not found from within. What we find is that power of breakthrough is found only through the power of the Holy Spirit at work within us. So we are going to do that by going back and forth each week in kind of a different way. One week we'll talk about a great hero of the faith in the Old Testament. In the next week we will dive into a practical study and conversation on the power of the Holy Spirit and how we can be filled with the Holy Spirit and walk in the Spirit. And this evening I want to talk about David and Goliath. That classic underdog tale, that classic story that we all know, a tipping point moment here in the valley of Elah as David steps in. But it's a tipping point moment not just for David, not just for the people of Israel, but it's also in a negative sense, a tipping point moment for Saul. I want to look at this story that we all know through the lens of a verse in 2 Corinthians, where we are called to live by faith and not by sight. And so just zoom in on that moment in the valley of Elah. And on one side of the valley, we have the Philistine army there, and they are powerful and mighty. And then on the other side of the valley, we have the Israelites, led by King Saul. And we enter into this story, and they are at a standstill. They are at a place of stagnation, which, if you are on the edge of a breakthrough or looking to overcome in a tipping point, a place of stagnation or being stalled out is the worst place you could probably be, right? And it's in this moment that we begin to see the tactic of the Philistines take place as they send out Goliath into the valley. So Goliath was physically imposing. His very presence struck fear into the hearts of the Israelites. And that's okay. That's a normal thing to happen. Even today, weaponry and armor and the things of this world that showed power do cause fear in our own hearts. They may be different weapons, but they still rule the day in the world and in the nations. And that's often how the enemy works, right? He comes and he strikes fear in our hearts. But notice then Goliath doesn't just strike fear by his power and might and military strength, but he also heaps shame upon the Israelites as well. And he's calling out to them morning and night, it says, day after day, defying them and defying the armies of the living God. And the enemy also works like that, heaping shame upon us, getting us to this place where we feel stuck, where we are afraid and we are shameful and we don't feel like we know what we can do. This spirals us down to places of anxiety. It can spiral us down to places of depression. We see that all take place here in the valley of Elah, in this place of stagnation for the Israelites, who we would say are living by sight in this moment. Some of them are angry because they feel like they're up against a corner and they're carrying this victim mentality. Some of them are depressed and swirling the drain, not wanting to even get out of the tent in the morning as that giant comes out and just gives his shame and sends his threats out each morning. The king himself was cowering there in the valley, not knowing what to do, completely stuck. They were living by sight because they were living by what they could see, and they couldn't see a pathway to victory beyond this giant, and so they did nothing at all, and they were stuck. Then David comes onto the scene. David is a man, though, that is not living by sight. He is living by faith. So David comes in, and he hears the same threats, and he experiences the same thing, but he's not all cocky necessarily in that sense where he's like, oh, I'm going to take on this giant because I have all these skills. And he's not enthralled by the victory and the gifts that will come to him from King Saul. But rather, he is indignant that this man is defying the armies of the living God. And so he goes into the king, and it's important to notice what he says he approaches the king. He doesn't approach, as we often tell the story, and just say, no, I can take down Goliath because I've trained, because I've myself have killed the wild animals, and I have taken care of my sheep by killing lions and killing bears. You know, if you notice in that text in 1 Samuel, which I encourage you in your groups to take a deeper look at, he says, no, time and again, the Lord delivered me from the hands of the wild beasts, and therefore the Lord will deliver me from this Philistine. David isn't saying, oh no, I'm so great, I can do this. He's saying, if anything, what I have practiced doing is I have practiced boldly following after my Father in heaven and allowing him to take the victory. Therefore, I believe that this Philistine will be no match, not for me, but he will be no match for God. That's the difference of a man living by faith and not by sight. So we see this, and David steps onto the stage, and of course, he takes the victory. And it changes. It's a tipping point moment for the people of Israel in his life. And it's not always received well. His own brother was burning with anger at this, challenging his motives. And it's just like a side note I want to mention there that oftentimes you'll experience that in life too. That those living by sight in the way of the world, when you step forward boldly in faith, in a way that doesn't make sense necessarily, where the odds are stacked against you, where you make a move of sacrifice, where you make a move of radical forgiveness or radical generosity, or live in a way that the world doesn't see as explainable, oftentimes that will evoke anger in them. It'll convict something inside of them. But David still went humbly before his king and then humbly before his God. You know, right before he goes into that valley, he picks up 5 stones. You may be familiar with that part of the story. And numbers are often significant in the story. And as he picks up those 5 stones, knowing that this is what is going to take him into battle against the giant, it's important to recall that 5 is the number of grace. And I believe that David knew he was going to have victory. But he wasn't going to have victory by his own might and the mightiness of his own faith, but he was going to have victory by the mightiness of the grace of God and how much God loved him. So I wanted to close out our time talking about this great king in these moments of tipping points in our life. And I was praying this week in particular over the 23rd Psalm, and something stuck out to me in particular in that Psalm around verse 4. And we don't know when David actually wrote that Psalm. Many think it was later in his life. And I was just praying and thinking about that verse and wondering, how many times has David been in the valley himself? Not just the valley of his own sin and despair, which he certainly was in. He was not a perfect man. But also literal valleys. Valleys where wars are taking place, where kingdoms are rising and falling, where he had to have victory or there was no way out at all. Moments of either breakdown or breakthrough. And I was wondering, perhaps he was writing the 23rd Psalm and hearkening back to the valley of Elah. The very first time the Lord led him into the valley of the shadow of death, to face the giant, to face his fears face to face. But notice in that text in the 23rd Psalm, which again I encourage you to read over tonight in your group, and it says that in the valley, God is with him. And in the valley, in the presence of his enemies, the Lord sets a table for David and he dines with him. And I think that's our call. That in the darkest valleys where our character is shown, where our faith is tested, to remember that it's there. The call is to just run into the arms of our Father. To just sit at the table and dine with him and allow him to fill us, for it is the power of the Holy Spirit that is there for breakthrough. God often leads you into the valley, into these tipping point moments. And what we're reminded is that for whatever reason, God chooses to not have you work around the valley or try and get underneath the valley or change up the situation. He says, no, the pathway out is through. That in these tipping point moments in the valley, the way out is through. But I'm going to be with you through it all. So my encouragement for you as a group is to pray and talk and discuss these tipping point moments in your life where your heart is in the Spirit. And I encourage you to come check us out next week as we talk more about the Holy Spirit. What does it mean to dine with the Lord and be filled and understand that on this side of eternity we are given so much more for the power of breakthrough?